And to be clear here, you're gonna get a lot more of the and I'm off to a flying start. So if you've ever wondered whether or not you should be cutting your baseboard standing up versus laying flat, today's your lucky day. I've spent years using both the methods, so I'm gonna quickly run you through the pros and the cons of each. Then I'll let you know which is actually the best one and the one that I use, despite the fact that 90% of people actually use the other method. So when it comes to cutting the baseboard standing up, probably the biggest pro, with the exception of this saw actually, is that almost every saw is going to be a lot easier to adjust the miter than it is beveling the saw left and right. And that's just because the scale up front is a lot bigger than it is on the bevels. On this particular saw here, the bevel scale is like 1.5 inches long. And it's gonna be easier to make micro adjustments with this bigger scale and the controls right up front. Say you want to go over to 46 degrees. So then the next pro of standing up and cutting is the old peek behind. What I mean by that is, say you're cutting the outside miter, you can actually mark the baseboard along the top and the back to mark the short point of an outside corner. And when you're standing the baseboard up, it's pretty easy to make the cut and then just peek behind to see if you've cut off the entire line. When you're laying the baseboard flat, you can't really look at the mark on the back, so you're gonna have to adjust your measuring and marking to more of a face-centric marking system. Another bonus that I've noticed over the years of cutting baseboards standing up, let's say you have a mark on the face for an inside miter or an outside miter. When you have the baseboard standing up like this, it's a lot easier to sight along the edge of the blade and line up your cut. And then the final pro that I'm gonna mention here is just the simplicity of the cut. There's not a lot of moving pieces. The chop saw is literally just chopping down. The only thing you want to avoid here is going too fast. I don't know how many times I've seen people that don't have a lot of saw experience hop on a saw and then just a lot of bad things can happen. You won't get a nice cut. Definitely take your time and smooth it out. So it's not all lawn darts and ice cream cones. There is some definite drawbacks to this method. The first con is the capacity limit. For any of your max capacity 12-inch saws, the biggest baseboard is probably going to be about 6.5 inches tall that you're going to be able to cut. For most saws, it usually maxes out around 4.5, 5 inches. For this little Ryobi saw over here, probably like a 3.25. This size baseboard is going to max out this saw. And you definitely need to put an auxiliary fence on here if you wanted to make these types of cuts. And the second real big con here is what I like to call floppy board syndrome. And that's just, this is just a shorter board and it's actually made out of real wood, so it's not going to be that floppy. But you get like a 16-foot MDF molding or even this wood molding in 16 feet. And then you get that thing holding up along the fence. That thing is going to want to flop off the back, especially anytime you want to make a cut and then maybe just slide the board a little bit. And then the last con that I will mention here is it's just a little more difficult to get this set up nice and flat. When you have the pieces standing on the edge, they're going to be carrying a lot more stiffness this way because the piece is thicker. So you need to take a little more time and care in getting a very nice, flat, accurate surface to make your cuts. Otherwise, the piece is going to be off axis on this base plate of the saw. So let's talk about the pros and cons of cutting baseboard laying down flat. And to be honest here, you're going to get a lot more of the benefits if you do have a slide saw as opposed to just a stationary saw. So the number one pro here is going to be capacity. With your slide saw, that's going to give you, this particular saw, I think is about 13 inches, 12.5 inches of capacity. Some of the DeWalt saws, I think they're up to 14, 15 inches. So you're just going to have a wider ranges of materials that you can cut. A lot of baseboards in high-end homes are going to be kind of in that 7, 8, 9 inch range, and you're going to need to adopt a style that can accommodate those bigger boards. And then the second big pro here is it's going to be a little easier to get a square cut. You're going to have a lot easier time getting this sitting flat on the base of the saw. Whether or not you have it leveled out just perfectly, you're always going to be able to push. Even if this was a 16-foot piece, you could just push that down to the base plate of the saw and get a nice square flat cut. Whereas if you have it standing up, like I said before, you're gonna have to take a little more time to make sure you have that perfectly leveled off. And then the last pro here that I will mention is the ease of approach cutting, which is just, you have a line, you line it up roughly, make a cut, and then slide it towards the blade and get right to the edge of the line. It's considerably easier when you're laying flat and safer in my opinion. I like to always hook my hand to the back of the saw and then tweak it towards the blade. You want to anchor your hand so that you're not going to be slipping towards a spinning blade. So it's not all margaritas and tacos here. There's some definite cons when it comes to cutting flat. The first of which being that a lot of times the bevel adjustment on saws are not nearly as good as the miter adjustment. On this Ryobi here, you have to reach around the back and the bevel scale is tiny, very hard to read, almost impossible to get very fine micro adjustments. And then yeah, I still have a big scar on my finger from my old Makita 10-inch slider, reaching around the back, twisting the knob, and then just, it happened a bunch of times, but once it got me pretty good. Still have the scar. The exception is really this Capex. The bevel adjustment on this thing is awesome. One of the things I love about this saw, but on 95% of other saws, it's not going to be nearly as easy as the miter adjustment. Another negative thing about cutting flat is if you're using a slide saw in particular, there's a lot more skill involved in getting a really nice cut. There's all types of things, like sometimes you might want to make a scoring cut. Do you cut all the way through? Do you make a series of cuts? It's going to depend on the material, but it does take a little bit more practice than just plunging down with the miter saw. And then the final thing that I'm going to mention here as a negative is if you're going to get into a slide saw, it's going to be more expensive and it's not going to be as durable because there's just more moving parts. If you take a look at that 12-inch stationary DeWalt chop saw, some guys buy that thing at the start of their career and then that thing will last like 10, 15 years in some cases. So the big question, is it better to cut your baseboard standing up versus laying down? Let's start with a caveat here. If you own a 12-inch saw that has a big tall fence and it's not sliding, it's going to be better for you to cut them standing up, assuming that the baseboard is within the tolerance of the saw. But if you're just starting out or you own a slide saw, you're looking for a saw, you're a carpenter starting out or just a handy homeowner, I'm going to recommend cutting laying flat. I've been doing that for the last 15 years. The thing that I like about it is no matter what type of material you're going to run into, you're always going to be able to use the same technique and cutting method. So you'll get good at it and you won't have to switch it out if you all of a sudden run into some bigger material, which has worked well for me in the past. And hey, if you're doing some baseboards, check out this video right over here. It's a pretty cool look at whether or not you should be coping your inside joints. And if you have some strong opinions about this either way or some experience to share with us, by all means, drop a comment. I love reading them and then usually I reply.